Continuação da leitura do livro The New Map, Chapter 19. The Three Questions. The clash over the South China Sea is about islands and territorial waters. It revolves around three issues. First, who owns the tiny land features that protrude out of the waters of the South China Sea? The importance of this question is that the jurisdiction over the water flows from land features. This question of sovereignty is familiarity an issue between China and the nations of Southeast Asia. China says its claims to sovereignty is rooted in history, which it succinctly set out in the December 2014 paper. China has indisputable sovereignty over the South Sea Islands and the adjacent waters. Chinese activities in the South China Sea date back to over 2,000 years ago. China was the first country to discover, name, explore, and exploit the resources of the South China Sea, and the first to continuously exercise sovereign power over them. From the 1930s to 1940s, Japan illegally seized some part of the South China Sea Islands during its aggression against China. At the end of the Second World War, the Chinese government resumed exercise of sovereignty over the South China Sea Islands. Other nations challenged the Chinese claim to sovereignty, arguing that for many centuries Southeast Asian and Arab merchants dominated trade in the region. Moreover, other countries and legal scholars argued that historical rights is too vague and ambiguous a claim to be the basis of sovereignty. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all dispute various Chinese claims and assert their own claims out into the South China Sea. None of these contested islands amount to much. All of them together add up in terms of territory to no more than 3 times the size of Central Park in New York City. To make matters even more complicated, there is a disagreement about whether some of the land features in the sea even count as islands at all in international law, or are only rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own. And artificial islands, installations, and structures do not possess the status of islands, and thus do not have legal rights to the waters around them. Yet, they can become facts. And that is what is happening in the South China Sea, where China is dredging millions of tons of rocks and sand to construct artificial islands atop a series of coral reefs. These new islands become facts on water, and military bases that provide anchorage and missile batteries, as well as runway that can handle China's strategic bombers. While both Malaysia and Taiwan have engaged in territorial reclamation in the South China Sea, the areas involved are very small. Nothing matches the speed and scale on which China is advancing its projects. To date, some 3,200 claimers acres. These islands would enable China to maintain continued air patrol over the South China Sea. That, in turn, could permit it at some point to implement an air defensive identification zone over the region, which would inevitably be challenged. The second question is whether the South China Sea itself, that is the water, constitutes international waters, high seas, or if it's part of the national territory of China. That is a matter of concern to the countries in the region, those nations whose trade passes through those waters, and the commercial shipping companies and navies of the world. Does the 9- map assert that 90% of the entire South China Sea itself is territorial waters of China? The original 1947-48 map describes itself as the map of the Chinese islands in the South China Sea. More recently, a spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs declares that China enjoys indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea, as well as the islands, and Chinese legal specialists claim that it has authority over the South China Sea. Many nations make their marine claims on the basis of 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which had involved negotiations with more than 150 countries over 14 years. China's assertion that the nine-dash line is a national boundary, which encompasses the sea itself, rests not on this convention, but rather, Beijing says, on the historical claim, with a foundation of the international law, including the customary law of discovery, occupation, and historical title. Other nations reply that the international law does not recognize history as the basis for the maritime jurisdiction. To affirm its position in this view, China would have had to exercise effective sovereignty over the South China Sea for a long and sustainable period of time in a well-known way, but some would say that China will be able to assert this claim by establishing and maintaining an entrenched position in the years ahead. The third question is about the EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone. The concept of exclusive economic zone was established by the Convention of the Law of the Sea. The EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone, is different from territorial waters, which generally extend 12 miles from shore. The EEZ reaches out 200 miles from shore. For most countries, the EEZ entails only economic rights to the fish in the waters and the oil and gas and minerals below in the seabed. The Chinese contend that the EEZ also gives its control over who passes through those waters. That directly pits the United States and China against each other. For the key question, very much at the heart of the dispute, is, as the international lawyer Robert Beckman puts it, not freedom of navigation in itself, but freedom of military activity in open ocean. The United States has repeatedly said that it is not talking signs in the disputes of the South China Sea, but only wants to see them settled peacefully in accordance with the UN Convention. The Chinese call this position hypocritical, because owing to opposition in the US Senate, the United States never actually signed the convention. But on the question of freedom to navigate, the United States takes a firm stand, for it regards freedom of the seas and open navigation are as fundamental to the law of the seas, including freedom of military actions in open seas. It is on this basis that the US Navy operates around the world. China, however, asserts that foreign navies must have the permission to sail in the China's EEZ, whether the claimed EEZ in the South China Sea or off the coast of China directly. According to the US position, which is generally accepted by most other nations, the US Navy can, for example, operate just beyond the 12-mile limits of Shanghai without asking by or leave of China. Beijing rejects that premise, although, ironically, it would afford China the right to do exactly the same just beyond 12 miles of San Diego. In 2012, 123 miles off the coast of the Philippines, China took control of the Scarborough Shoal, named for an unfortunate British sea clipper shipwrecked there in 1784, and closed it off to Philippine ships. The Philippines hardly had any military of its own with which to respond, so it used the only weapon available to it, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. It brought a case challenging the Nine-Dash Line to an international tribunal established in The Hague. Vietnam associated itself with the claim. In 2016, the tribunal delivered its verdict wholly in the Philippines' favor. It rejected the legal and historical claims of the Nine-Dash Line, and China denounced the decision and made clear that it would not recognize it, let alone abide by it or the Philippines' illegal claims. The decision changed nothing. At this point, 3 seems to be the no definition means to resolve the difference among the different countries. The gulf is too wide. For instance, Vietnam, relying on the same argument formerly used by the French colonial administrations, says its rights go back to 1816, when the Vietnamese kingdom claimed sovereignty over the Spratlys. The Chinese replied that this claim is invalid because, at the same time, Vietnam was tributary state to the Chinese Empire, not an independent country, and thus was in no position to assert sovereignty over anything. The struggle over the South China Sea has turned into what Robert Beckman, whose specialty is the law of the sea in the Southeast Asia, calls the game of maps. He adds, the maps tell you everything. The Nine-Dash Map may be the starting point and the defining document for the game, but there are other maps. Hanging on the wall in the chambers of the Judge Antonio Carpio in the Supreme Court of the Philippines, on Padre Faura Street in Manila, in a map published by the Jesuit in 1734. It identifies that Scarborough Shoal with the Tagalog word panakot for threat and danger. That matters because Tagalog is the main native language of the Philippines. In 2014, Vietnam mounted its own maps exhibit to support its claims in what it calls the East Sea. That same year, another player made its entry, rather re-entry, into the game of maps: Taiwan. After all, the Nine-Dash Line had started with the nationalists. Taiwan decided to put some of its original maps on public display. They were consistent with the People's Republic Nine-Dash Line, but, said Taiwan's president Ma In-jeou, the maps demonstrated that what the nationalist government was claiming in 1947 with its dashed map were the islands of the South China Sea, but not all the waters. President Ma added a plea that the interested nations solve their differences peacefully, and for otherwise, he warned, 2 trains were on track to crash into each other, or to use a more appropriate metaphor, 2 navies were on a collision course.